everybody, and welcome back to another episode of RoboReplay. In this one, we're going to be taking a look at the finals, the entire three-match finals that ended up happening at IRI this past weekend. And if you don't know what IRI is, it is probably the biggest or highest level of competition that you'll ever see in FRC, along with Chessy Champs, of course. This is like the East's version of the Tournament of Champions, of basically where the best teams from all around the East, as well as other teams that fly in, will all come here, and then the same thing is on the West, and that's called Chessy Champs, which is 254's event. So we're going to be taking a look at the finals here, and before we get into the actual gameplay, I just want to point out that some of the match results here, or like score totals that you'll see, you might be like, oh, that's the world record. But an important thing to note is that at RI, one of the biggest rule changes that was made was the introduction of 2 extra algae per side on the ground. And that was just given so that teams have more game pieces to score, and we'll talk about the ramifications of that later on. But I thought it was a really cool introduction, albeit without some backsides as to now you can't compare high scores, because this isn't really comparable with what happens here to what happened at Einstein's, because there's now 2 extra game pieces that are worth more, right? But either way, the way that IRI does alliance selection, we have 2056 here, Alliance 1 captain. They picked 1690, Orbit. Probably 2 of the top 5 robots in the world easily. And then the way that alliance selection works is that they actually got their first choice of their second pick. So 4028 is actually the 17th robot on alliance selection, rather than what would Alliance 1 would normally have the 24th, right? So this alliance is going to be an absolute powerhouse, and we'll see it as they'll end up winning this entire series. But Alliance 7 is no slouch as well. So 422 is the Alliance 7 captain, and the way that they got to Alliance 7, even though they're extremely good, as you might recognize the number, is that they ended up declining someone else, so they ended up as Alliance 7 captain, but they still have a lot of scoring. And then 8044, Den and Venom, we talked about them before, they were on Einstein's, they won their division, extremely good team. And then 868, of course, incredible team as well. So everybody here is like a ridiculously high level team. So let's see how they decide to play this out. Starting off here, we're going to see 4028 do something that I really love. So if you just pay attention to 4028 here, and what we normally saw teams doing with the algae was picking up these 2 algae and doing a 3-piece algae if you're going to do 3 algae, right? But 4028 decided that they're just going to code in an algae for the side balls as well, that are just going to be placed on the ground, which I thought was really impressive that they managed to do all of that just for IRI, right? And so what ends up happening is that basically you have 2 ground algae that are really hard to steal now because of the fact that they're gone, right? So here, 4028 could easily sneak over at the end of Telly and just steal one of these algae if Blue isn't careful. But because of the fact that 4028 has stolen these 2, these guys can't also go just rip over here and steal one, or rather rip over like this and steal one, because of the fact that they'd have to go onto the reef and actually get one, or they'd have to go all the way back here to pick up an algae. And we talked about the 8-point swing before. Stealing an algae really does matter, as we'll end up seeing later in this game. Another thing to note at the end of this auto is that 868 doesn't end up actually finishing their entire auto sequence, so they're going to be Alliance 7 is going to end up being down by about 20 points when they don't really need to, and you'll see how this impacts the rest of the entire teleop, because they're just going to be down cycles and trying to make it up, and it'll allow 4028 to go for some crazy things. In terms of autos, you can see 8044 went for a backside auto, 2056 did their, we're going to do part of this, and then we're also going to take this back node auto, and then everyone else is just doing a classic 4-piece, right? And then going into teleop, first thing to notice, 4028 will be doing this a lot throughout the series. They're just going to rip over, steal an algae, and just get out for free. And so we talked about denying algae, and you'll see immediately that 422 realizes we have to just protect this algae over here, because otherwise 428 will just score this algae, and they'll just come over and steal the other one. So the Blue Alliance is just like, okay, we have to keep scoring these algae first before doing anything else. And it makes it so that it allows 4028 to just come over here and just slow them down for free, right? They come over here, they don't get an algae, but they still force them off of coral, and you can already see the coral difference is starting to mount up along with algae. They're already 3 cycles ahead in algae, and 3 cycles ahead in coral, and that will only start to build because you have some of the best robots in the world on the Red Alliance. Something interesting that I want to note here is that 2056 is like entirely doing super cycles. So I'll go back a little bit here so that you can actually see what happens with it. But if we take a look at 2056, look at them when they pick up this algae, right? They will always do this thing with the algae where they do what's called a super cycle, where no matter where the coral is on the ground, they will always try to search out a coral when they pick up an algae, so that once they do get to the barge and they put one up, they're always able to then maximize their cycle time by just throwing one in. And even though this piece doesn't actually end up going in, it does show how 2056 does this like quite a lot. They also did this at Worlds, and one of the reasons that they do this is just reducing your cycle time, right? Because in a game like a pick and place, 2023, 2025, these types of games, having low cycle times and maximizing that low cycle time is extremely important if you want to try and win. Something I want to note over here is if we take a look at this human player, the way that he throws it, I actually really love. They have this technique that they do. And so he'll see that if he wants to throw it down towards where Orbit's going to go, because Orbit's more taking over like this space, he'll just throw it down with 2 hands, right? And it'll just roll forward a little bit. Maybe not go that far, but it gets pretty close to Orbit so that they're able to score pretty efficiently. But if he wants to throw one to the side, as he did right there, take a look at his hands over here. He like puts it in and then he just shoves it so it starts spinning around as it goes. And so it'll end up basically just bouncing all the way to where 4028 would want to pick it up. And so because he's doing both of that, he's able to feed both Orbit and 4028 completely permanently, so they never have to move more than like here to pick up a coral, which is like just entirely comes to the fact that they learned this technique and it's now being ridiculously efficient. And so if we look at the actual scores now, we can see that that one algae does end up leading to a plus 8-point swing, because now you have one less algae that you can score. And in a game, in a match where teams are scoring so much and are basically completing most of the pieces on the ground, this plus 8 really matters compared to just like an average offseason, right? Because you're never going to really complete the entire match or entire set of game pieces, but these alliances will end up doing that, and we'll see that later. And so because of the fact that they're already up 8 points, this is like a 30 point deficit, and I think it entirely comes from auto, because as you can see, because of the fact that they had to spend time clearing up the algae here, and they had to spend time on the algae in the L4s, they're now slower to go down the reef, and they're now slower to get to the L1s, which is what the Alliance 1 is going to end up doing, and just completely outscoring them. And you can see, like, these guys are starting to do more L1s over here, but something I really liked from 26 Orbit, they did the Madtown thing where they're so confident that their alliance is going to end up doing L1s anyways, that they try to do L1s before they finish the entire reef, because it doesn't really matter, right? And another thing that we talked about before with, like, if you're comparing the Madtown Alliance and how they're scoring pieces horizontally, the reason that it doesn't matter that 1690 and 2056 score pieces a little bit vertically is because of the fact that they have such a big point gap that it doesn't matter how much time they take or if they take the extra second to line up, because this alliance is just so far behind from the auto mishap that happened that they're not going to be able to make up that score, especially when they finish all the reef pieces. And now, because of the fact that these guys are starting to run out of coral, what does 4028 do? They go over and they're stealing coral from the other side. And this use of 4028 as a steal bot I thought was really, really interesting. And I'll talk about this later in my full Rescape breakdown, which I'll post in probably sometime in the fall. But I really wish that there were a little bit less coral or game pieces in general in this game, because this stealing strategy that came up, that you can see that they've stolen 2 coral now, and they still have coral left on the ground, but they'll end up putting up 24 coral or about 25. And so this coral that's on the ground, that's, or like the stealer role, didn't really end up coming into fruition in matches that weren't at like the Einstein level, which I thought was a little bit sad, because it's such a cool strategy to employ, and I thought that if it had time to grow as a strategy, that it could become something really, really cool. But instead, because we have so many game pieces, there's no reason to ever go steal coral as a game piece instead of just taking an algae. And so, if we look at the final score, 44 to 22 will do this thing often at the end of the match because of the fact that they know they're down. They're just going to go and they're just going to go try to hit 40-28. They end up incurring a foul for it, trying to deny a climb. They do end up denying a climb, and it is a fine trade for them because they deny 10 points for the price of 6. So you end up getting with a plus 4 points overall. But the final score here, minus penalties, would end up being 296. But if you consider that 422 did cause that penalty, and you assume that they had a barge here because 40-28 would end up hitting their climb for the rest of the time here, then the score is really almost like a 300 plus score, highest we've ever seen clean, if you assume that the barge happened, right? But I think this is a great primer for what you're going to see throughout the rest of the series, right? 2056 and 1690 are going to put up some insane scores. 40-28 is going to do some crazy stealing, and Alliance 7 is going to have to figure out a way to do some strategy that is going to manage to outscore them in some other way, which we'll end up seeing in match 2 because this does end up going to 3 matches. So we'll end up seeing in this match that 868 does end up getting their entire auto, and you'll see that they're able to actually do a lot more scoring in teleop because of the fact that they finished their entire auto. Because they're now not behind on coral, they're able to stay ahead, and they're able to just continue adding on to what they already have. And something really big that happened here, controversial, but I'll explain my thoughts on it later, is that 40-28 goes over, and 868 does a great job playing defense on them here. So look at 868 they know 40-28 is going to come over to steal the algae. They play a little bit of defense. They try to shove them against the wall, and 40-28 ends up barreling forward and gets themselves beached. And now, 40-28 gets themselves beached. As much as I think 2056 and 1690 are very good robots, I do not believe that they can outscore 3 extremely good robots with just them two and no third robot. It seems that 2056 also thinks so. Because what ends up happening is, after some cycles 2056 does, is they say, okay, 40-28 is beached. Even though we're going to get a penalty if we go to the other side, we're going to take that risk of we're going to get maybe 2 or 3 penalties, but we're going to unbeach 40-28 and then both get back because the penalties is worth less than what 40-28 will bring in terms of scoring. And so 2056 decides to say, okay, we're going to go over there, as 422 is also stealing an algae from the other side. In case you didn't notice, they were sitting here the entire time trying to take one off, and they ended up getting one because of the fact that 2056 was distracted and isn't covering the side to try to punish 422 for penalties. Which is a really heads-up play from 422, knowing that one of them might end up moving to the other side to try to defend 40-28, so they come over here, knowing that this zone will now be open, take an algae, and end up getting a plus 8 point swing for their alliance. And now 2056 is over here. Every single 3 seconds, and watch the refs here, that 2056 is here, is another 2 points into 6 points that are going to be given to the blue lines. And so 2056 tries to knock them off again, stuck against the wall, knock off again, and we see the exact same strategy used against the Alliance 1 on Curie getting used here. Except, in this case, we're not stopping the robot from getting out because we don't want them to score on their reef. We're stopping them because it's free penalties and probably a free match win just from 2056 being here. Because if you think back to what the match I covered with Alliance 5 versus Alliance 1 on Curie, then 3005 came over here, tried to steal an algae, and they got punished by the Alliance captain and just defended and kept inside of this ring the whole time, and they incurred a bunch of penalties because of the fact that, this penalty line is there. But they weren't getting penalties because there were 2 robots, which is what's happening here. And Alliance 7 does a great job just completely denying 2056 here. And 422, the highest scorer on this alliance, is the one completely stopping 2056 from getting away. And 2056 almost gets away. And honestly, I think they should have just tanked one more penalty here and just ripped through the cage and just been done with it. But what ends up happening is they say, okay, we can't run into the cages. That's another 6 points. So they try to back up. And that leads to a whole lot more penalties. If you can just see the ref here, they end up getting stuck on 422 again. The highest scorer is playing defense on them, and they just get trapped inside of this bend while Orbit is just trying to make up all the score that they're losing. And so by the time 2056 escapes, this score isn't actually accurate at this point because they haven't put in all the penalties. But this match is just lost. Right. Alliance 7 is up by 4 algae at this point. They're barely even down by Coral even after defending 2056 for so long. And even though, if we skip towards the end here, right, this, in terms of game pieces, it's still pretty close, right? You do have an extra 2 algae here, but, and a little bit of Coral here. But in game pieces, it's a pretty solid performance considering it was a 2v3 the entire time. But because of the fact that 2056 spent so long on the other side and was getting defended by 422 and the entire Blue Alliance, and with a very heads-up play, they end up just completely annihilating them with basically the entirety being penalty points. And even if there weren't penalty points, they still did outscore them in terms of Coral, in terms of game pieces, right? One less Coral and a little bit more algae. And while you could say, yeah, but 2056 wasn't scoring, 422, 8044, and 868 were all getting hindered by 2056 being over there and playing defense on them. So either way, I think the moment that 4028 gets beached, that match is basically lost no matter what, especially with the fact that one of them did end up climbing at the end, and this could have even been a 335 or whatever it would be, clean. So this was an Alliance 7 win. Great heads up play by them. One, for the algae steal, realizing that 2056 was going to leave their post to try to get 4028 unbeached, and two, for just completely locking 2056 down, one of the best drivers in the world, to try to just get as many penalty points as possible and to bring this to the finals 3, which they did end up doing. So let's check that one out. Alright, getting into the last match of IRI, one of the craziest ones that we had here. Every single robot here does end up hitting their auto at the end. 8044 does their backside, and both of these robots, or both these alliances rather, are pretty even going into telly. And coming out of the auto, we'll see that one of the biggest things here is that 422 is going to end up going for the same algae play that they did last time, right? They're going to hope that someone isn't watching this post, and someone's going to be going for an algae, just taking one off here first, and they're going to be on this side, all going to be on this side of the field, so they can steal an algae over here and get away with it. And that is exactly what ends up happening. Take a look at 422. They take their own algae, put it up, run to the other side, because of the fact that both these alliances are going for algae that are on the corner first, so there's a lot of empty space here for them to take an algae off of. Come over, rip an algae off quick, and go up. And honestly, this is a pretty good play by them. If they stopped here and just backed up and just went the other way, I think it could have made them win the game. Maybe made it a little bit closer, but they do end up greeting a little bit here, probably because they're playing Orbit and 2056, so you kind of have to greed for anything you can, and they do end up getting punished by 2056 here. Good heads up play. They end up dropping the algae on the ground and just getting 6 free points for the Red Alliance here when they're already down by 4 coral and 2 algae at this point. And so even though they are able to end up stealing an algae, and so they did deny, right? They did get the +8 over here. They do end up giving the other line 6 points, so it's only really a +2 play, which is the same as stealing a coral in like the start of the match, which there's a reason no one does it, right? There's just not enough value in terms of getting 2 points for you to lose by just going over there. So they do end up making the play a little bit less valuable. And on the other side, Blue Alliance does end up missing some game pieces, but this match is kind of just over before it began because of the fact that it's 2056 and 1690, and if you can't stop them from just going ham on their own pieces, they have insane human player play where these guys will all be able to score like with 3-second cycles. And if you're not being literally perfect with your play, the game's kind of just lost, which is what ends up happening here. And even though they do end up putting up a valiant fight, it doesn't really matter because of the fact that, or look at the way that they're getting pieces, right? 40-28, the furthest that these guys have to come is over here, and they're just putting pieces in, and it's insane. Something I did like from 40-28 in this match that I'm sure they were doing the entire time, but I want to point it out here, is well, the coral steel over here, right? They're going to go for another coral steel. They're not stealing algae or anything. They just want to completely annihilate them. Probably because these human players have now said that we're out of pieces. We need more pieces because all the pieces are now here. So instead of being above this line, they're now behind it. So 40-28 says, okay, we're going to go over there, lose some time in our cycles so that you guys can we don't have to contest each other for pieces, and you guys can just put them up. But 48-28, when the reef wasn't full, does a great job moving around and hovering on the backside and filling in any branches that they saw were missing, which I thought was really nice. 44-22, again, going for a play to try to salvage the match. At this point, it's a 50-point deficit. Can't really do anything here. Just gets pushed off. And because of the fact they're defending 2056, it doesn't really end up mattering because 2056 hits the climb anyways. And they do end up winning IRI. Congrats to the Red Alliance. They played absolutely insane. And at the end here, final score does end up being 321-274, but it is 18 penalty points, so it's really like a 303. And you did get the barge this time, so you can say for sure that this was really impressive, an absolutely insane match. And something else to note here is that if we try to convert this into cycles and try to compare it with the Einstein Alliances, if we take this algae and we say, okay, we're going to take 2 cycles off of the algae and give us 2 cycles of L1s, if we just assume that cycles are even in terms of both, this now becomes this now you have a minus 4 because of the 2 algae compared to 2 L1 corals. It's just a 4-point difference. And so if you subtract 4 from the score, it's still 299. So that is the peak that anyone has scored if you just look at, if you try to convert it to the best of your ability. So either way, even if you don't convert it, a 303 clean is an incredible score. Alliance 1 absolutely deserved to win this, but hats off to Alliance 7 for pulling out a strategy in the second match to bring this to 3. And honestly, no one was really beating this Alliance going into IRI. Once 2056 ranks first, most everyone knew what was going to happen. So congrats to everybody who played at IRI. Congrats to this Alliance 1 for winning it. See you next time, because I'll be breaking down some more matches of IRI that I thought were really cool, because there are too many good teams to not look at some more good matches here. Thanks for watching, and have a lovely day.